residential districts. One was single-family homes, and one was everything else. And then they had light industrial, heavy industrial, and I think commercial districts as well. So that's sort of the 1920s. It also didn't have heights, and except for the single-family districts, it didn't have density, it didn't have parking, it didn't have rear yard, open space, all of the things that we've really come to love in our planning code. You can see where a lot of the, I don't know if you guys can read these numbers in the back, but a lot of the development happened in the 20s. So you can see that big bar is the 1920s. And when the blue bar is really big and the red bar is low, that's when you're getting lots of multi-unit buildings. And when the red bar and the blue bar are really close, you're getting a lot of single-family homes. So equal number of buildings as there are units. In 1955, we did one other major update to the planning code where we took those 2 residential districts and 3 industrial commercial districts and split it into 12. So then we had 12 districts. Only a few of those districts had residential density limits, but the neighborhood commercial districts did not, and the commercial districts did not. Still, we had no height limits in 1955. Okay. Then in 1972, or late 60s, early 70s, we were really doing a lot of work on downtown, getting ready for sort of what became our downtown plan in the mid-80s. One of those things was doing a city general plan and an urban design element, which is, we are the first city, again, this is something that San Francisco is touted for, having in our general plan not just a land use plan, a transportation plan, and an open space plan, but an urban design element. One of the things that came out of that is this idea that we really need to focus on our downtown. We need a lot of heights in our downtown, and we also are seeing a decline in population. Oh boy, that's not very helpful. I can't read the numbers even, but what we are seeing about right here is a slight decline in population in the residents. That's actually a helpful slide, sorry about that. But so we were worried about the loss of population in the city and worried that our downtown was going to lose its attractiveness and all of our businesses would go to the suburbs. So we really invested in our downtown. We wanted to allow a lot of high rises there. There was a lot of interest. When you read any literature, I think the most detailed book is Chester Hartman's about San Francisco's planning history. You hear it as this downtown interest versus the neighborhood's interest. And that kind of really, to me, explains, that description of that really explains this zoning, because the idea in this era was, let's focus on downtown, and we can kind of just seal the rest of the city at its existing density and its existing height limits. And that's how we picked our height limits for the west sides of the city and a lot of our density limits. If you could read this slide, I would tell you that it also illustrates that our population is increasing. So that's why we're back at this question of how do we fit all of these new people in this city that's zoned for a declining population by and large. Furthermore, the number of people is increasing. We're higher than we've ever been, but also keep in mind the household size is a lot smaller than it was historically. So when we had an equal population to what we have now, we had fewer households than we do today. Oh, this is not going well. If you could read this.
I'm going to reload it.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, read it on the computer, totally. So what that map was showing was the city's first approach to answering this question. Not the city of San Francisco, but every city in the US. The first thing they did is look at the underutilized lands and do major community planning efforts. So you should recognize a lot of these areas are Eastern Neighborhoods plans, Market Octavia, a lot of work in the Bayview, really looking at, do we need all of this land for these former industrial uses, or can we add housing and other uses to that area? We did a lot of work. I would call this our like 1990 to end of 2000 work. A lot of the construction that you're seeing now is a result of this. The reason we did focus planning efforts there was great opportunity and really antiquated zoning that didn't match the needs of what we needed now. It was such a change to these neighborhoods that it really required comprehensive thinking. I'm happy to answer more questions about those processes. So this is our 2010 density map. You can see this kind of shows the buildings and the density. The darker places are more dense. The middle one just shows you where that growth is, just the growth we've planned for. And you can see we're just kind of adding more density where we already have density. The map on the right is A plus B equals C. So most of our density and most of our new growth for the next 30 years will be in the areas that we did that major planning. I really love this map. My choreographer does not, or cartographer. It shows you what year the zoning was established. The darker zoning districts are older, and the lighter zoning districts are new. This just really underscores that. We've been doing a lot of planning in this city. We really have been planning and replanning the same areas to really get it right. But it also begs the question of how do we modernize our zoning? I know I'm way over. I'm looking at you. Okay, so one of the questions that we're going to be asking is density. This map is also one of my favorite pieces of our team's research. All of those dots show buildings that are above their allowed density limit. How did that happen? Mostly, these buildings were built before density limits existed. And when we applied density limits across the entire west side of the city, we didn't have GIS, we didn't have Google, we didn't really have a lot of data, we kind of eyeballed a lot of it. So these zoning controls, density controls, these height controls, we hold them sacred. They're not really a science, they're a art, I would say. I really want to talk about the Affordable Housing Loans Program, but I also want to talk about all these other tools we have. This map has some dots where even with the existing density limits changing not at all, we can add a lot of secondary units to these outlying neighborhoods. I've already showed this at another talk here, but this is just, I think that this conversation and our relationship with ADUs as we legislate over time really mirrors our conversation with all housing issues. At first, we really wanted to reduce them, then we were sort of considering them, and now is really the time that we figure out how they work in our neighborhoods. This map shows some new ADUs. I hope this doesn't happen for you guys. This map shows areas where we recently legislated the addition of new ADUs. There are a couple pilot programs. If you are doing seismic work, you can add an ADU. Also, if you, in District 3 and 8, it's been added. Here's another antiquated piece of our planning code. There are certain districts in the city of San Francisco where if you are 5 people or more that are unrelated, you cannot live together, where if you are related, you can live together. I'm sure there was some really important policy goal behind that, but I'm not sure it reflects our current values and the way we think about land use regulation today. And then finally, and Amanda is going to talk through this in great detail, but our Affordable Housing Bonus Program, I'm sure many of you have seen this map. It's been in the media a lot. This is our program area. It's a place where we're looking at these density limits that were kind of blanketed across the west side of the city and these height limits. Do they really make sense? Do they match up? How do we relook at them with our modern affordable housing goals for 33% affordability, middle income housing, and providing housing for all of our future households? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to kind of walk through some of the work she's done on this project.
Okay, sound check for the back of the room. How are you doing by the windows? Okay, if I start going low, just holler. Oh, you've got some upcoming meetings.
Oh, yes. Come on out, you guys.
Come on out. So yeah, as Kearstin said, I'm going to dive into the work that we did at David Baker Architects with Cycle Consulting to kind of inform the legislation and just kind of explain some of the thinking about how the program conclusions came about. So as Kearstin showed, the blue shows the program area, and as a firm, we really took a deep dive into 11 particular sites, where we looked at them the same way we would look at them if a developer came to us and asked us, what could we do here? Oh no, a resolution problem.
Yeah.
But we found in the program area, the density is constrained by 2 factors that Kearstin has been talking about. One, I think we're all really, really familiar with, which is just simple, how high, how tall, what are the setbacks, bulk, etc. Basically what's kind of the jello mold you can fill. And that's what most of the current or kind of planning in the last 20 years, that's how density is regulated in the city. But the other I would say kind of less familiar way that density is also regulated is by these density limits that are applied as a numerical value per lot. So it says that you're allowed 1 unit per 200 square foot of lot area all the way to 800 square foot of lot area. And there tends to be a logic, you get closer to the downtown, the more units you're allowed. But what we found, and the other thing with density limits, this means that the same amount of square footage could mean 25 really big, awesome units or 100, smaller, more modest units. And what we found was that these two things rarely related. Reload me, Christopher.
Yeah.
So this is an example in the Western Addition. It's zoned NC3. You can go 130 feet. With the density limit, I think you're allowed 60 units.
We have a different reader.
And what that means, so just remember that kind of box there. What that means, if you were to fill the box, you would get 60 units that I think were like 3,000 square foot, which I would love to live in. And I'm sure, royalty or whatever lives in, maybe that's a certain threshold, but that's not really realistic for the market. A lot of us couldn't really afford that, and we're really not going to see a developer come and build this. So it means that this site is going to continue to be a parking lot when it really could be housing for a city that needs housing. And what actually would probably be more likely to be developed is, let's just say like you built a 1,000 square foot unit and 60 of those. You can see there's a lot of physical envelope that's left on the table. So those things really miss each other. And so one of the first low-hanging conclusions we came to as a firm was if you eliminate the density caps, it actually really unlocks the potential of a lot of these sites. It doesn't mean that they're unregulated. It actually just means that a regulation that kind of was fighting with another regulation that necessarily didn't relate is removed. And it allows us to trust in the physical form that the city has set in place. So that was our first conclusion. Christopher went to find another computer. Oh, there you are. So the exciting thing was, for me, about this program was that, hey, if we just do this little tweak, it means a big change. And it means that it's not going to kind of result in these towers in our neighborhoods all over the place. And I'll get into a couple examples that show that. But then the other thing that we were looking at is, well, how could we get to 30% affordable units on site? What would make that possible? And on some of the sites, we realized that, by unlocking the density limits, that would allow a developer to come and put that on a site. But it also meant that on some sites, you would need to some extra height to do that. And so the program resulted in, if you kind of max out the thresholds of affordability within the program, you could have up to 2 stories of height. Thanks, Christopher. And also there would be a limit on unit size. So, you couldn't just max out the program and do all these tiny units. It's the same that we've been doing in the eastern neighborhoods and a lot of the recent plan areas where there would be a requirement for 40% 2 bedrooms. So just to kind of look at 3 particular sites and figure out what that really means. So we didn't spend a ton of time on the architecture here. We were just trying to understand, what are these buildings going to feel like? So the red line shows you the existing height limit. The blue line shows you if you were to max out the program, kind of how high you could go. And one thing that I should mention is, this is an optional program. Every developer is going to approach this site differently. And so what might work for one developer might not work for another. So not everybody's going to go to the blue line. So I think that's something we should all kind of remember. So with this zoning here, you can do 15 homes. You can go up to 50 feet. And if you were to fill that box with 50 homes, that would result in 2,400 square foot units. So again, that's pretty big as an average unit size. Not to say you couldn't have some that big, but it's really rare you're going to see a whole building filled with that size of unit. So if we were to eliminate the density caps, notice the building envelope did not change, which I think is really exciting. But we almost doubled the density, and we still have a really reasonable square footage, like 1,300 square foot average unit size, which I think is really exciting. But if a developer were to add even more affordability at that same unit size, you could get up to 46 homes with the additional 2 stories. And this is a site in Nom Hill where the zoning allows 47 homes at a 65-foot high limit. This would yield a little bit smaller of a unit size, 750, which is actually what we see a lot with market average now. And this is a lot closer to downtown. And under the affordable housing bonus program, kind of all the way up, you could get 65 homes. This is a site out on Geary. You could do, per the zoning, 8 homes and 40 feet, or a complete max out would be 13 homes at 65 feet. And another thing to note that I'm not really going to go into today is that there are a set of design guidelines that we worked with the planning department on, but that they've really been thoughtfully fleshing out that would not just allow, you know, boxes in this particular envelope to just come up. There's going to be some constraints about how should the sidewalls be articulated? How should the building speak to its neighbor? You know, there should always be a ground floor, active ground floor, things like that. So the other thing we looked at, we started to get really curious and notice, and now Kearstin gave us kind of the reasons why. We started to realize there's a lot of tall buildings in our more well-established neighborhoods. And so again, so the red line shows you what's allowed currently. The blue line shows the affordable housing bonus program. So basically what we found out is there are all these great buildings that already live among us that are this tall or taller than what's going to even be allowed. This one, I don't know about you guys, I always see the postcard with the painted ladies, but they always leave out this apartment building. You know, I don't hear cursing out in the streets at Alamo Square. Like, it's always packed. There's always film shoots, you know, like, I just love that the painted ladies lives with a big brother, and they're okay. And this is another one at Jackson and Baker. And then, you know, that's kind of anecdotal evidence that we were kind of finding out in the field. And then we're going to zoom in on this, but Palo, the city, used his GIS data to show me that the yellow represents buildings where we're actually under the height limit. That's a lot. The orange freckles are buildings that are at the height limit, and the maroon freckles are buildings that are over the height limit. And I think the real magic to note here is that I think freckles is kind of a really good way to put it, because our cities are organic places. You know, they evolve because there are places where humans inhabit. We plan, and we are very, very thoughtful. But by the nature of kind of cities and as they're layered over time, they result in kind of organic forms, and that's what makes them really nice. You know, I think none of us like homogeneous environments because that's not who we are. It's not human. And so the exciting thing to me about the affordable housing bonus program is, you know, it's not going to cut a whole patch of the city and become one thing. I think it's actually going to result in more freckles. So if we were to kind of speed up 10 years from now and we put dots on where the people actually kind of opted into the program, I think, you know, you're not going to see like big swatches. You're just going to see another layer of freckles. With that, Chris.
You want to start on this slide or from the top?
No, from the top, sorry. Hi. All right.
This computer was covered in dust.
Yeah.
Do you want to put your...
Yeah, I was going to say, you may have a beefier air book with you.
Yeah, no, this is just my notes.
Ah.
I'm going to do it at the same time. So, as was mentioned, I'm a professor of architecture at CCA and run the Urban Works Agency with my colleague Niraj Bhatia, who's in the audience with us. And we, as Kearstin mentioned, have done a series of collaborations with her, kind of looking at some of the programs and legislation the city is actually implementing, and using our kind of academic leeway to experiment a little bit more with them and do some blue sky thinking around these topics of housing and density in San Francisco. And so this past fall we ran a studio which was called Horizontalism, that was kind of loosely based on the affordable housing density bonus program, but really looking at density and zoning controls and questioning some of our preconceptions of them and assumptions about zoning as a kind of blunt tool for managing urban design and the form of the city. So, we also based the studio on a premise that these are times where incrementalism and just muddling through aren't really serving us. We all know we have a housing crisis on our hands, and we really see that as, obviously there is a policy component to that, there is a kind of political component to that, but it's also a spatial problem. And as architects and urban designers, those spatial tools are the ones that we can look into and manipulate to try to understand and unpack what other potentials might exist for addressing it. So our studio, okay, it's not advancing, so I might have to tell you next slide. Okay. We're all pretty familiar with the statistics about the housing crisis. I probably don't need to reiterate them here. But our approach is that this is a crisis that we can't really afford to do nothing, and we can't afford to, we think, address it on a small scale, parcel by parcel, incremental timeline, but that we really need to think outside the box and consider other forms of density by which the city could accommodate its current residents, prevent more displacement, and accommodate the influx of residents that are coming over the next half century or so. And we kind of took a approach where, short of a massive influx of public funding for affordable housing, we all know we need to build affordable housing in the city. We think that a dramatic increase in supply is one of the necessary tools for putting downward pressure on housing prices in combination with affordable housing programs to create a kind of workable solution and meet demand. So in early 2014, you guys may be familiar, Ted Egan, the city's chief economist, estimated that it would take about 100,000 units of new housing to begin to have a stabilizing effect on median rents in San Francisco. And this is actually equal to the number of units that have been constructed since 1920. So, per those slides that Kearstin showed, we have really, kind of slowed down in our pace of production of new housing. And while this is kind of an outlandish amount, we wanted to just take it as a given and unpack that and understand what would it take to build 100,000 new units of housing in San Francisco. And knowing that supply is not the only solution, and obviously we also have a broader regional housing and jobs imbalance, but that really the production of new capacity is one critical component among many, and one that is within the kind of purview of architects and designers. So next slide. We're currently, I think, in the city, and always have been, a little bit uncomfortable with density, and our image of density, tends to be one of high-rise towers downtown or south of Market, kind of like the slides on the top. And certainly, a lot of that kind of development has been occurring in those areas. And as Kearstin alluded to as well, there is maybe not high-rise, but a heavy focus on other kinds of more mid-rise development, mainly along the kind of eastern part of the city, and again, per the maps that Kearstin showed. But this kind of density, and the word density, has been so closely linked with words like Manhattanization, and the wall on the waterfront, and a kind of antagonism with a kind of image of the city that people have in San Francisco as a kind of low density, 2 to 3 story, low rise fabric of Victorians. But we really wanted to question whether we need to be locked into that duality. Are those the only two forms of urban form that we have at hand, or are there other ways that we can experiment and create new capacity, for the people who we're expecting to accommodate over the next 30 to 40 years? Just next slide. Stepping back, we're living in a time when there is an alarming degree of economic inequality in this country, and in contrast to maybe other developed or even developing nations that are working to decrease inequality, it seems to only be rising at a really alarming rate. One of my favorite political philosophers, Roberto Unger, has called on us to create what he calls a high-energy democracy. A democracy that empowers people to kind of counteract the political deadlock and ossification of our social and political institutions, and really create a kind of environment of rapid experimentation with different kinds of social constructs and different forms of association that can empower local communities and turn into new kinds of institutions that really serve to decrease that inequality in a way that just isn't happening with our current political environment. And in San Francisco, I think we're experiencing a really tangible result of this inequality, where the increasing divide between those who can and cannot afford to have housing in this city creates a tangible feeling of inequality. So we believe that we must bring this same kind of high-energy democracy to planning and design in our city. We have certain tools at hand, and Kearstin has explained the kind of history of some of those tools, but that we need to really experiment with many different ways of accommodating density and housing that's affordable at all income levels, not only to current citizens, but to those that are expected to arrive over the next several years. So the intent of our studio was to be on the outside edge of that kind of experimentation and look at maybe more radical or untested forms of density, and to really kind of challenge our image of the city, especially in areas that we may not have on our current radar in terms of where density might occur. Next slide. So we kind of took Kearstin's map of the RMU districts and tried to find within that a set of areas that we could experiment with, most of which are a little bit off the radar in terms of where density is occurring in the city. So areas such as Geary Boulevard, Taraval, Outer Mission, 3rd Street, even in the kind of Divisadero, Fillmore kind of area, Lombard Street in Van Ness. So we broke our studio into teams, and each team took on one of these areas and attempted to kind of unpack what was there and understand how density could be evaluated. One of the things we also wanted to kind of call into question was how zoning almost assumes a two-dimensional city. It sort of assumes a series of parcels. There is a height limit to those parcels, and you can increase it or decrease it, or mess with height and bulk, but it doesn't really take into account topography. And obviously, in San Francisco, topography plays a very important role in terms of the kind of overall urban form and image of the city. So we really wanted to take that into account and understand how density and topography could create other ways of producing additional capacity and accessing that capacity, which tends to be up above existing buildings. Next slide. And so we broke those neighborhoods down into these sort of types, corridors like Taraval Street, where most of the rest of the neighborhood is fairly uniform, but Taraval has a kind of single neighborhood commercial district along its edges. Double corridors like Geary and Clement Street that really operate as a pair. Intersections and patches of intersections. So each has their own kind of characteristics, both in plan but also as a kind of sectional form, as kind of hierarchies build up towards those major streets. Next slide. So for instance, this group looked at Lombard and really understood Lombard as a kind of triple corridor almost with its association with Union Street and Chestnut Street, very closely linked. And you can see the light blue is the actual overlay of the NC districts, and we so we may have been, for instance, considering some parcels that aren't currently under that zoning, but that might want to be expanded into that district. Next slide. This is a little hard to see on the screen, but we tried to look at these, at the three-dimensional form of these neighborhoods, and so we modeled all of the current existing buildings and cut sections through them to really understand how topography interacts with that building form. And we identified a number of kind of focus areas within those corridors. Next slide. And what we try to do in those is, it's a little bit light here, but if you look at the kind of section in these axonometric views, understand the current built form, and much like what Amanda and David Baker's group was doing, seeing the existing zoning and how the existing form in many cases doesn't even go up to that existing height limit. And then what is the additional 2 stories that the affordable housing density bonus program would add, which is that balloon level. And so looking at that three-dimensionally, we could see areas where existing built form actually exceeded the current zoning, as Amanda alluded to. But more importantly, see all of the area that is currently underutilized and really as a three-dimensional volume. And then with the layer of the additional 2 stories that the proposed program would provide, and then we sort of flipped the Jell-O mold upside down so you could see underneath to really start to get a sort of tangible three-dimensional sense of what underutilized current capacity there is now. Next slide. So we did that for several different areas, and each one had its own particular kind of texture and amount of underutilized capacity. Next slide. And then we kind of took a step back and looked beyond San Francisco at some other cities that either have topographic conditions that are similar to San Francisco, even kind of a historical fabric like we have, but that have taken advantage of that topography or different eras of building to add density and capacity. So these are images of Edinburgh, where the old center of the city has pretty extreme topography, and over different eras, different layers of built form have been added that take advantage of topography. For instance, this is a walkway kind of public space that peels off the top of a hill and creates kind of a new datum and public level on top of what were originally lower buildings and a whole new capacity for those buildings above, or bridges that kind of cross through dense areas and create space both below them and kind of multiple street levels, above where the bridge is now and down where the original topography was. So we were really trying to look at these next slide, cities like Hong Kong, which has created a kind of density also through topography, but also through the implementation of these pedestrian bridges and walkways that connect higher levels of public space to lower levels, or Vienna, where a program for developing new density on the rooftops above the kind of very established 5-story datum that city has. And next slide. From those, we try to develop what we call a set of zoning hacks, so kind of experimental zoning controls that could, again, take advantage of topography, of creating new public space at different levels to create more built form. And then applied that to, next slide, back to the neighborhoods that we were focusing on. So for instance, in this case, the student took the area just a block on either side of Lombard Street, and go to the next slide, actually, it's a little more clear. Implemented a kind of infrastructural move, a transportation infrastructure that put all of the through traffic on that street in a tunnel, connecting to the new tunnels that are going under the Presidio, with the logic that right now Lombard Street really is trying to act like a highway and as a surface level street, but is doing neither very well. So by putting the through traffic into a tunnel, there's a large amount of capacity of land that could be used for some more quiet local street traffic, and then at the center of that, much like Octavia Boulevard, could be a piece of land on top of which a new built form could occur. Then he also capitalized on a lot of the empty parking lots and underutilized land around the kind of motel, loose 50s era road movie kind of fabric of Lombard Street. And in those empty parcels built a series of very small towers that were connected with a different level of subgrade access to parking garages and services below. And then on top of that, kind of bridged between those towers with a series of very 1 unit wide, kind of pencil thin bars of housing that connected with public walkways to the towers and allowed for access both from those parcels that were in the kind of rear yards or parking lots of the motels, but also to this kind of center traffic lane that has become a new area for commercial or institutional buildings. So go to the next slide. And so this is the kind of image cutting through Lombard Street where you see these are the little towers in the rear yards. This is Lombard with the tunnels for the through traffic. There's a couple of quiet lanes of local traffic. This middle bar running down the center aisle of Lombard Street, and a kind of section cut view of that showing new shopping, educational institutions, museums, etc., that connect to this bar of housing and the towers beyond. So I'm going to, in the interest of time and having discussion, leave it at there. There were 7 more projects like this, and we actually are organizing an exhibition here at SPUR this coming September. So we're going to be continuing to develop these projects, and along with another studio from Yale to kind of show a broad range of experimentation with housing and density in San Francisco. So I will leave it there for now, and hope to see you at the exhibition, and look forward to your questions and comments.